Good day, students. Today is our lecture number 25 of sociolinguistics. Once again, it's going to be a continuation of what we've studied in the previous lectures. Now, the previous was giving you an introduction more of sociolinguistics because I wanted you to understand the difference between psycholinguistics and sociolinguistics. So today we will continue from where we broke off. Now, when we are speaking about codes, in sociolinguistics code, the code of language is very important. So it is possible to refer to a language or a variety of a language as a code. So we can refer to it as a code. The term is useful because it is neutral. Now, terms like dialect, language, style, standard language, pidgin, and Creole are inclined to arouse emotions also. So in contrast, the neutral term code, taken from information theory, can be used to refer to any kind of system that two or more people employ for communication. So it actually, so in contrast, we could say that instead of just saying the term neutral, we could say that taken from the information theory, it can be used to refer to any kind of system that two or more people would employ for communication. Now, it can actually be used for a system used by a single person. Now, as when someone devises a private code to protect certain secrets. So we do that even with our, for example, with our laptops or our computers or our cell phones. We apply a code, a personal code, something that maybe is numerical or some words or a name or even our birth dates or some private information that we use to protect it from anybody else using that without our permission. So in a way, if you say it, so language or a variety of language could be also called as a code. Now, actually a system, all of this would refer to, like, if when more than one person is discussing about communication, what they need to do is that whatever they devise, they put a code to it, so it is linked to them personally. Now, above all of the above then are codes of this admittedly loose definition. Now, what is interesting is the factors that govern the choice of a particular code on a particular occasion. So according to the occasion, whatever code we decide to give to that. Now, in the terms of language, how do we use it? Now, why do people choose to use one code rather than another? What brings about shifts from one code to another? And why do they occasionally prefer to use a code formed from two other codes by switching back and forth between the two or even mixing them? That's also a little confusing. So such questions as these assume that there are indeed few single code speakers. So people are nearly always faced with choosing an appropriate code when they speak. So very young children, so sometimes people would choose that, yes, I'm going to speak with a certain code and I'm going to relate my questions to that. So when you don't, trying to understand why people do that is linked to the different societies that they belong from, and the different social classes or religions and so on and so forth. So people are nearly always faced with choosing an appropriate code when they speak. So either it could be like we can define code as in formal or informal language also. So very young children may be exceptions also, as may learners of a new language. Now, for a while at least, and the victims of certain pathological conditions also. So in general, however, when you open your mouth, you must choose a particular language or a dialect or style or register or variety that is a particular code. So when we are speaking or when we plan to speak or produce language, then we either choose the dialect, which would be a code, the style, which would be a code also, formal or informal. We would register or variety to a particular code that we're going to speak in this way. Now, you cannot avoid doing so. So moreover, you can and will shift as the need arises from one code to another. So that means, like, in different contexts or different situations, you do shift, and that would be code switching. When you're shifting from one code to another, let's say, for example, that at your home you're used to speaking in your native language, and then at your university or school or colleges you're forced to speak in a second language, which would be, in your case, English. So that would be when you are switching codes. That would be one example. Then the second example could be that different social classes. Now, if you are speaking to a colleague, your mannerism and the code that you use for language would be very different. But when you are, let's say, speaking to a gardener or a guard, then your way of choosing that, the code, would be different also. And you will have to bring yourself down a little bit to the level of that person so he can understand you. So sometimes we do code switching even in our daily life, just to make communication easy between the two individuals. So within each code there will also be the possibility of choices, not all of which will have the same import, because some will be more marked than others, and that would be that will be more significant also. So the various choices will have different social meanings. Now, what are some of the factors that influence the choices we make? We will look mainly at the phenomenon of code switching in bilingual and multilingual situations now. However, many of the issues that we will see there will also arise with those codes, which can be called sub-varieties of a single language. Now, for example, dialect styles and registers. Now, in particular, we will examine the so-called diglossic situation, in which clear functional differences between the codes govern the choice. So, following a brief look at some types of bilingual situations, we will consider code switching as a phenomenon that requires serious explanation. So, when we go into a discussion of code switching, so use the term code allows us to use derivative terms like codification and recodification. Now, writing systems are said to be codifications of speech. So how do English and Chinese writings systems differ as codification of their respective languages? So what we want to see is that when we put language into a code, and then we study the language according to a code, then sometimes we do codification and recodification. Now, how do the English and Chinese writings differ? Now, you want to see how the English alphabets would differ from the way the Chinese would write their alphabets, and then how they would construct their sentence, and the way and usage of grammar. Number two would be a recodification. Now, is a further manipulation of a code. That means that we are changing the code even more. Now, Morse code and Pig Latin are two simple recodifications. Now, Morse code, if you have heard this term before, is used maybe mostly in your army or your navy when they are sending signals of a language, when they're transmitting speech information through different tapping sounds. When they're tapping and sending the signals of codes, and then the other person would decode that, and it would become a message. So they have specific codes for, let's say, an alphabet or a word, so and different meanings for those words. So what they do is, how many times, let's say, that you're going to tap it, you must have seen it in movies also, that on a telephone or something, people tap the sound, like giving the code of a particular message, when especially spies use that. And so Morse code would be that, when you're using the tapping signals, and that is converted into language. Now, what are the principles behind each of that? Now, some codifications and recodifications have very clear social functions. So you might care to look at the following from such a perspective. So when we see it upside down, in Hale in 1971, that Hanuno, Love Play in Cochrane in 1959, and glossolalia in Seymour in 1973 referred to this perspective. So diglossia. Now, a diglossia situation exists in a society when it has two distinct codes which show clear functional separation. Now, that is, one code is employed in one set of circumstances and the other is in an entirely different set. Now, Ferguson in 1959 has defined diglossia as follows. Diglossia is a relatively stable situation, language situation, in which, in addition to the primary dialects of the language, which may include standard or regional standards, there is a very divergent, highly codified, often grammatically more complex, superposed variety. The vehicle of a large and respected body of written literature, either of an earlier period or in another speech community. So, when you can say that there, it would be in a relatively stable language situation, that means that there would be, in addition to the primary dialect and then to the standard. And grammatically it would be more complex, sometimes more difficult. So the vehicle of a large and respected body of written literature, either of an earlier period, like what has been written long ago, or in another speech community. So, which is learned largely by formal education and is used for most written and formal spoken purposes also, but is not used by any sector of the community for ordinary conversation. So it's can be used in formal education, but cannot be used in or for formal speaking processes, but not in an ordinary conversation. We wouldn't use that code of language. So in the same article, he identifies 4 language situations now which show the major characteristics of the diglossic phenomenon: Arabic, Swiss German, Haitian, French and Creole. Haitian is a combination of French and Creole, and Greek. Now, in each situation, there is a high variety of language and a low variety, a H and an L. So each variety has its own specialized functions, and each is viewed differently by those who are aware of both. So in the Arabic situation, the 2 varieties are classical Arabic, and the various regional colloquial varieties, the lower variety. In Switzerland, they are standard German and Swiss German. So in Haiti, the varieties are standard French and Haitian Creole. So in Greece, they are the Catrevosa and the Demotiki and Demotic. They are the varieties also of low varieties of Greek language. Now, in each case, the 2 varieties have coexisted for a long period. So sometimes, as in the case of Arabic, for many centuries. Consequently, so Arabic has been these 2 varieties of high variety and low variety in a language code has existed in Arabic language for centuries, a long period of time. So consequently, the phenomenon of diglossia is not ephemeral in nature. In fact, the opposite is true. So it appears to be a persistent social and linguistic phenomenon. Now, a key defining characteristic of diglossia is that the 2 varieties are kept quite apart in their function. So one is used in one set of circumstances and the other in an entirely different set. So for example, the high variety, the H varieties, may be used for delivering sermons and formal lectures, especially in a parliament or a legislative body, for giving political speeches, for broadcasting the news on radio and television, and for writing poetry, fine literature, and editorials in newspapers. So in that part, in all of these things, like in lectures and speeches, and if we're speaking on the radio or writing poetry or editorials in a newspaper, we would use the high variety of code of language. Now, in contrast, the L varieties, the low variety of the code of language, may be used in giving instructions to workers in low prestige occupations or to household servants, in conversation with familiars in like soap operas. Soap operas are dramas that, like you see on your television also. Soap opera would be a drama that consists of comedy and tragedy and love and happiness and family issues and social issues, a combination of those, very similar to the dramas that you see on television, Pakistani television or Indian television nowadays. So they do have the American version of soap operas also. So the L varieties may be used in conversations with familiars in soap operas and popular programs on the radio, in captions on political cartoons in newspapers, and in folk literature. So on occasion, a person may lecture in a H variety, in a high variety, but answer questions about its contents or explain parts of it in the low variety, so as to ensure the understanding. So what we do is that maybe we can, like, it's very similar to what you could consider your lectures of, like, your coursework. For example, the lectures that I'm giving you. Now, what I explain to you, what I read out to you, is the high variety of the code of language. The things are difficult. But when I start explaining it, I try to use normal terms that are used in normal conversation and more familiar to you than the terms like are used in formal education. So when I am explaining that to you, that would be that I would be using a low variety so that it would be easier for you to understand the context that I'm teaching you. So that's how people change from the high variety of code to the low variety, so it's understandable for the other person. Now, if I would speak to, let's say, another professor of literature, then maybe if I'm giving the same lecture and, let's say, a person who's already an expert in this field won't have difficulty understanding the context or the meaning of the language. So you do not use an H variety in circumstances calling for an L variety. For example, for addressing a servant, you wouldn't use the high quality or high variety of it, nor do you usually use an L variety when an H is called for. So we don't switch between those two codes. We don't say that, yes, wherever a high variety is required, we would use a low variety, or where a low variety is required, we would use a high variety of language. Now, for example, for writing a serious work of literature, now, maybe speaking to a servant, I would use the low variety of language, so it would be easy for that person to understand, because considering that he wouldn't be as highly educated as myself. So, but when I'm writing a serious work of literature, at that point, I cannot use simple language. So I need to use the complicated or formal term of literature language so that I can be taken seriously in my profession. Now, you may indeed do the latter, but it may be a risky endeavor. So it is kind of the thing that Chaucer did for the English of this day. And it requires a certain willingness on the part of both the writer and the others. So to break away from a diglossic situation by extending the L variety into the functions normally associated only with the high variety. So for about 3 centuries after the Norman conquest of 1066, English and Norman French coexisted in England in a diglossic situation, with Norman French and the H variety and English of the low variety. Now, however, gradually the L variety, the low variety, assumed more and more functions associated with the H, so that by Chaucer's time, it had become possible to use the L variety for a major literary work, so that it could be more easier for the people to understand that work. Now, the H variety is the prestigious, powerful variety. The L variety lacks prestige and power. So in fact, there may be so little prestige attached to the L variety that people may even deny that they know it, although they may be observed to use it far more frequently than the H variety. Now, associated with this prestige valuation for the H variety, there is likely to be a strong feeling that the prestige is deserved because of the H variety is more beautiful, logical and expressive than the L variety. So that is why it is deemed appropriate for literary use, for religious purposes, and so on. Now, there may also be considerable and widespread resistance to translating certain books into the L variety. So, for example, the Quran into one of or other colloquial varieties of Arabic, or the Bible into Haitian Creole or Democratic Greek. So sometimes you can see that there is a widespread resistance in trying to translate a book, especially the important books that are considered as our religious books, and the Bible for the Christians and the Quran for the Muslims. So we can't shift or translate that book without having experts to do it. So you cannot just translate the Quran into a variety of simple Arabic language, you see. You have to use that code. The Bible you cannot translate into Haitian Creole or Demotic Greek either. So we should note that even today many speakers of English resist the Bible in any form other than the King James Version. So most of them would just go with the King James Version because maybe it's more easier for them to understand it, or because it follows the code and rule of the language. So this last feeling concerning the natural superiority of the H variety is likely to be reinforced by the fact that a considerable body of literature will be found to exist in that variety and almost none in the other. Now, that literature may also be regarded as reflecting essential values about culture, and when parts of it are classical literature, deemed worthy of recalling by allusion and quotations on occasions suitable for the employment of the H variety. So speakers of Arabic in particular gain prestige from being able to allude to classical sources. So sometimes the people who do speak Arabic as their native language, they would gain prestige for being able to allude to classical sources. That means that to speak and pronounce the language in the proper way. So they would be considered prestigious. Now, the folk literature associated with the L variety will have none of the same prestige. It may interest folklorists, and it may be transmuted into an H variety by writers skilled in the high variety of language, but it is unlikely to be the stuff of which literary histories and traditions are made in its raw form. So sometimes then it's difficult for them to understand the literary histories and the traditions that are made in raw form. So another important difference between the high variety of language and the low varieties is that all children learn the L variety. So they learn the low variety because it's easier and simpler for them to understand that part of the language. Now, some may concurrently learn the H variety, but many do not learn it at all. So because children are just learning to speak a language, so it's easier for them to learn the L variety, which is more simpler than the H variety, which would be very complicated and mostly which educated adults would use. So sometimes they do learn the H variety, but most of the time they don't learn it at all. So, for example, most Haitians have no knowledge at all of standard French, but all can speak some variety of Haitian Creole, although some, as I have said, may deny that they have this ability. So the H variety is also likely to be learned in some kind of formal setting, for example in classrooms or as a part of a religious or cultural indoctrination. So sometimes the H variety, the children do learn that in some kind of formal setting, maybe like in a classroom or even in the university you would learn, or maybe as a part of a religious teaching, or maybe when they are teaching, somebody's teaching you about the cultural indoctrination. So to this extent, the H variety is taught, whereas the L variety is learned. So we teach the H variety because we're teaching them the more pure way of language, but the L variety is just learned because that is very automatic and natural for us to learn that. So teaching requires the availability of grammars and dictionaries, standardized texts, and some widely accepted view about the nature of what is being taught and how it is most effectively to be taught. So there are usually no comparable grammars or dictionaries and standardized texts for the L variety. And any view of that variety is likely to be highly pejorative in nature. So when such grammars and other aids do exist, they have in many cases been written by outsiders or foreign linguists. So they are also likely to be neither well known to the people whose linguistic usage they describe, nor well received by those people. So since such works are unlikely to support some of the myths that accompany diglossia, particularly the myth that the L variety lacks any kind of grammar, the L variety often shows a tendency to borrow learned words from the H variety, particularly when speakers try to use the L variety in some formal way. So sometimes, like, it would be also likely that some person who is not well known to the people who use linguistic as a formal language, they would describe, they couldn't describe it well. And since the work that is unlikely to support some of the myths that accompany diglossia, especially the myth that the L variety kind of lacks the use of grammar, and we don't use grammar properly in the L variety, and we are not very particular of the grammatical rules in it. The L variety often shows a tendency to borrow learned words from the H variety so that it can be more appropriate. Now, particularly when speakers try to use the L variety in more formal ways, so they would try to apply the grammatical rules of the H variety. Now the result is a certain admixture of the H vocabulary into the L. Now on other occasions though, there may be distinctly different pairs of words that would be doublets and in the H and L varieties to refer to very common objects and concepts. Now, since the domains of use of the two varieties do not intersect, there will be an L word for use in the L situations and an H word for use in the H situations, with no possibility of transferring the one to the other. So sometimes on occasions we would say that there are different, distinctly different pairs of words that we would use in the H variety of language or the L variety of the language, which would be referred to very common objects and concepts also. So, but because the domains of the use of the two varieties would not be combining or intersecting or interfering with each other, so there will be an L word for use in L situations and there would be an H word to use in the H situations for that particular. It could be the same thing, but we would have a different word to use in the L variety and a different word in the H variety. So transferring the one to the other. Now, so far as the pronunciation of the two varieties is concerned, the L system will often appear to be more basic. However, now when we say that the L variety would be more basic because the pronunciation of the words would be more basic in the L variety than in the H variety. Now, however, actual circumstances can vary according to different situations. Now, whereas the two varieties of Greek have very similar sound systems, there is a considerable difference between classical Arabic and the colloquial varieties. So, and still greater difference between High German and Swiss German. So even though that the sounds would be familiar, and we would have maybe very close sounding pronunciations for similar words, but there would be a huge difference between the classical Arabic, that would be the traditional Arabic that is used in the literature or in the Holy Book, or then what it would be used in the common conversational Arabic variety, the colloquial variety. Or then you can say the difference between High German and what Swiss German. So Swiss German would be, say, an alteration of the language, wouldn't be that high and pure. So diglossia is a widespread phenomenon in the word, well attested in both space, for example, varieties of Tamil in the south of India, and time, for example, Latin in Europe in the Middle Ages. So it's a widespread phenomenon in the world, and we would say, like, we could attest both of the spaces by, like, say, the varieties, for example, like how they use the different varieties of language, let's say in India. And so in the south of India they use the language Tamil, which is very different from Hindi, and then in the Latin in Europe, how it was used in the Middle Ages long ago. So according to Ferguson in 1959, it is likely to come into being when number one, there is a sizable body of literature in the language closely related to, or even identical with the natural language of the community. So we would say that there is a sizable body of literature. That means that more literature is available in the language closely related to or even identical with the natural language of the community. And when literacy in the community is limited to a small elite and a suitable period of time, so of the order of several centuries, and it passes from the establishment from 1 to 2. So people living in a diglossic community do not usually regard diglossia as a problem. So it becomes a problem when there is a growth of literacy, or when there is a desire to decrease regional and or social barriers, or when a need is seen for a unified national language. So in Haiti, any attempt to develop literacy had to confront directly the issue of whether to increase the amount of standard French in it taught, or to elevate the L variety, Haitian Creole, into the national language. So at that time in Haiti, they had this problem that they were trying to, like, do they want to use the standard French? Do they want to teach that, or do they want to maybe improve or make it more easy for them to speak the L variety, or taught the L variety, which would be Haitian Creole, which is a mixture of Haitian French and Creole, into the national language that they're using there. So Haitian Creole was eventually recognized as a national language in 1983, with prestigious French, of course, the other. So in Haiti, there were two languages that were considered prestigious, and they were recognized as the national language of that country. In 1983, they had Haitian Creole and French. These two were considered as the national language of that country. Now, both languages were made official in 1987. Now, there has been an ongoing debate about the most appropriate orthography, also spelling system for Haitian Creole. Now, about the use of certain letters and accents, and about whether the differences between French and Haitian Creole should be minimized in orthography for Haitian Creole, or whether that orthography should be as transparent as possible in relating letters to sounds, particularly the sounds of the most widespread variety of the Haitian Creole. So French now, though not widely used, has such prestige that according to Skefilin and Dosset in 1998, virtually any proposal of an orthography for Creole has created resistance both to the adoption of the orthography and to the use of Creole as a medium of instruction in school. So they had a difference. There was a huge matter of prestige that they were thinking that should we the resistance that should we use Creole as a medium to teach in the school or not. So the double resistance comes from both the masses and the educated elite minority. So the masses use the officialization of written and spoken Creole in school as limiting their access to French and consequently their social and economic mobility. Now the elites who already know Creole do not see the point of teaching it in any form or in school. So the Greeks have still not entirely solved the problems associated with their the two varieties. Conservative Greeks want to resolve any differences in favor of the H variety, but liberals favor the L variety more. Now, it was at one time that you could judge a Greek's social and political attitudes by the way he or she declined third declension nouns. So the 20th century witnessed a long and sometimes bitter struggle between supporters of the two varieties. So by the time they got to the 20th century, like the Greeks would still not entirely solve the problem, because for them the conservative Greeks found it difficult to agree that people can use the L variety instead of the H variety, and they wouldn't favor the differences between both of them. And because according to them, they thought that the H variety is much more prestigious than the L variety, and the L variety cannot be used instead of the H variety. So one time in the Greek social and political attitudes, by the way, that they declined to the third declination nouns. Now in the 20th century they witnessed a bitter struggle to support both of the varieties in the Greek nation. So religious authorities condemned a 1921 translation of the New Testament into Demotic Greek, and this action led to rioting in the streets of Athens. So religious authorities condemned, that means that they were against translation of the New Testament, that means the Bible, into Demotic Greek language, so that people could understand it. So and this action was because they condemned it and they said it's not possible to do it. This action led to many riots and fights and disruption in the streets of Athens. So one consequence of the language disagreement was that when the liberal government of the 1960s was overthrown by the colonials in 1967, the former government, that means the liberal government, programmed to extend the use of Demotic was superseded by restoration of use of the H variety, which was Catharvosa. So the former government's program, they extended the use of the Demotic, which was superseded by the restoration that they wanted to use the H variety instead of the L variety. Now, for example, in education, the suppression of Demotic because of its association with left-wing views. Now, with the return to constitutional government in 1975, the H was superseded in return by the L. So they superseded it, and Demotic was declared the official language of Greece in 1976, and Catharvosa disappeared almost entirely from the public view. And so mostly then they got the language which was the liberal government had given, that was more of the L variety. Now, the new model for Greece seems to be based on the variety spoken in Athens. Now, today, the opponents of this new Greek language, based on the L variety, would attack it for being improvised and cut off from its roots, so which are said to be the former H variety and ancient Greek phrengodiki in 1992. Now, Tesseronis in 2002 says that the two most recent Greek dictionaries, the Dictionary of Modern Greek Language and the Dictionary of Common Modern Greek, show that the process of standardization continues. So the Dictionary of Modern Greek Language finds its roots in Katharvo, so that means the H variety, and the Dictionary of Common Modern Greek would find its roots in Demotiki, which would be the L variety. Now, however, both point to eventual unification around the variety spoken in Athens and to the H and L division. Now, the reason why I am telling you all of this is that you have to realize that language, you cannot just see the language as the perspective in your own society. What you need to learn is what sociolinguistics is based on and how language is affected in different societies and how language is treated, and what are the investigations of that language, so that you have a worldwide knowledge of different languages and the terms used in it. So that's why we take examples from different countries and different language and societies also. So the linguistic situations in Haiti and Greece are intimately tied to power relationships among social groups. Now, traditionally in each country, the H variety has been associated with an elite and the L variety with everyone else. So diglossia reinforces social distinctions. It is used to assert social position and to keep people in their place. Now, particularly those at the lower end of the social hierarchy. So any move to extend the L variety, even in the case of Haiti, to make the population literate in any variety, is likely to be perceived to be a direct threat to those who want to maintain traditional relationships and the existing power structure. So he never actually became Swiss, neither on paper nor in his heart, and you could tell from his language that he had not grown up there either. So it was not only his language that showed that he was a foreigner, his way of life showed it too. So it wasn't just that, see, you can tell when people come, let's say foreigners come to your country to live here. Like even, let's say, for example, I would once again give my own example, that for Pakistan, I am a foreigner. Okay, so because I was born and educated in the US, I was brought up there since childhood, so I had all my education from the US. Now when I came to Pakistan, I was adopting a new culture, a new society and a new language. So when I mixed all of those, that you can see that, okay, maybe I can speak the language Urdu now properly, but because I was not grown up here, you can still tell the difference that I am not a native speaker of that language. So sometimes you can tell that people are foreigners. So he, in his case, it was the same thing. Now he preferred to associate with his German compatriots rather than with the natives. So, and was a member of the treasurer of their society. So he was a member of the treasurers of the German compatriot society. So Swiss-German diglossia has its own stabilizing factors. So Switzerland is a multilingual country, and in Switzerland, they use German, French, and Italian. And these are the 3 official languages used in Switzerland. So, like in Pakistan, there are 2 official languages, Urdu and English. The same way in Switzerland, they would have German as an official language, French as an official language, and Italian as an official language. So, strong constitutional protection is provided for German, the H variety, of which is taught in the schools in Switzerland and used in official publications, newspapers, literature, and church services. So mainly in Switzerland they would use the high variety of German language in churches, in newspapers, in publications, and in literature. And they even teach that in school there. Now, this allows the German Swiss to communicate with speakers of German elsewhere in Europe. So what it does is that it allows them to speak to any person who speaks German language anywhere else living in the European region, and they don't have difficulty understanding the language. And it gives them access to everything written in standard German. So because they're learning it in the school, then a German Swiss, that means people who are living in Switzerland, won't have difficulty in understanding any written text in the standard German language. Now, however, the Germans in Switzerland can also assert their independence for other Germans through use of their L variety. So this is their own distinctive unifying spoken variety of German, one in which they take a special pride. The continuation of the High German Swiss diglossic situations now depends very much on the continued effectiveness of educating Swiss German children to use High German in the schools so as to encourage diglossia there. So some Swiss do worry that such teaching of High German may not always produce the desired results, and that any quest for identity through increased use of Swiss German might lead to growing cultural isolation from other users of German. So in much the same way, the people of Luxembourg have achieved a certain distinctiveness with their own diglossic, or better still, triglossic situation. So you can see Newton in 1996 for that. In this case, Luxembourgish, called Luxembourgisch, a variety of German, is the L variety, and Standard German is the H variety. So, when Rodin had his book printed in 1872, he had no success with it. With too much intrigue, he had trodden on some people's toes. That means like he displeased some people, and they could not forgive him for that. So only a generation later did Rodin begin to receive his rightful place. So his children, at least, experienced the making good in 1927 in some of the wrong that had been done to him. So, however, the situation is a little more complicated in Luxembourg than in Switzerland, because still another language, French, is involved. Now, all 3 languages, German, French, and Luxembourgish, have been official languages since the 1984. So inhabitants of Luxembourg not only use Luxembourgish, for example, in ordinary conversation, and Standard German, for example, in letter writing, books and newspapers, but they also use French, for example, in parliament and higher education. You can see Klein in 1984 for that example. Now, moreover, they frequently borrow words from French for use in Luxembourgish. So consequently, it is not unusual for a speaker of Standard German who goes to live in Luxembourg to feel that Luxembourgish is a variety of French rather than a variety of German. So French is highly regarded in Luxembourg and is also the most widely used language. So by 96% of residents, although 81% can speak German and 80% can speak Luxembourgish, Verhelen in 2002. So, however, now the clear marker of Luxembourg identity among Luxembourgers is their use of Luxembourgish. It is a solidarity marker, just as is the use of Swiss German and Swiss Germans. So the Arabic situation is different again than from the German situation. There are a number of flourishing regional varieties of the L variety in language, and many Arabs would like to see the Arab-speaking world unify around one variety. So there is a flourishing variety even in the L variety of language. But the Arabs would prefer that if the whole world would unify into one variety and speak either the H or the L or only one variety of the L. Now they acknowledge the highly restricted uses of the H variety, but also revere it for certain characteristics that they ascribe to it: its beauty, its logic, and its richness. So they are proud of the beauty, logic, and richness of the high variety of the Arabic language. Now, classical Arabic is also the language of the Quran. So that would be classical Arabic, but was based long ago. So it also is used in the Holy Quran. When you read the Holy Quran, you can see that version of Arabic which is very different from the spoken version of or written form of Arabic used nowadays. So Ferguson has pointed out that choosing one colloquial variety of Arabic to elevate above all others poses a number of problems. So we can't choose one particular L variety of or colloquial variety of Arabic to elevate and make it more superior than the other varieties, because that would create problems then. Now, almost certainly any Arab will tell you that the variety he or she speaks is the best. So they will never agree that the other varieties may be better. So there would be considerable disagreement about where one should begin any attempt to standardize modern Arabic on a single colloquial variety. So there is, however, a consensus among Arabs that any standard that may eventually emerge will be a version of the H variety, developed to meet modern needs and purged of regional peculiarities and foreign impurities. So, while acknowledging that diaglossic situations are essentially stable, Ferguson did predict that in 1959, on page 340 of his research work, that what he thought the future held for the situations he examined. So he regarded the situation in Switzerland as relatively stable. But the Arabic one, now the Arabic one seemed to point to the development of several regional standard varieties of Arabic, each using a considerable amount of vocabulary drawn from the classical Arabic also. So that's why that was one point of development. But in Haiti, there would be a slow development of Haitian Creole based on the L variety of the capital, Port-au-Prince. So because of the capital, then the development of the Haitian Creole of the L variety version can't be developed that much, because they wouldn't want to use that in the capital of the city. So finally, in Greece, the standard would be based on the L variety of Athens, with considerable admixture of vocabulary from Katharvosa. That was the H variety. Now, what Ferguson describes as narrow or classical diaglossic situations, they require the use of very divergent varieties of the same language, and there are few good examples of that. Now, a best example according to his view was that they would require less divergent varieties. So Fisherman has broadened or extended the term to include a wider variety of language situations. Now, for Fisherman, in 1980, page 3, diglossia is an enduring societal arrangement extending at least beyond a 3-generation period. Now, such that two languages, each have their secure, phenomenologically legitimate and widely implemented functions. So by acknowledging that his use of the term language also includes sub-varieties of one language. Fisherman includes Ferguson's examples also. So he does add, though, that in case of the two varieties of the same language, they be sufficiently different from one another, that without schooling, the elevated variety cannot be understood by speakers of the vernacular form. So Fisherman's proposal extends the concept of diglossia to include bilingual and multilingual situations in which the different languages have quite different functions. Now, for example, one language is used in one set of circumstances and the other in an entirely different set, and such difference is felt to be normal and proper. So Fisherman gives examples such as the biblical Hebrew and the Yiddish for many Jews. So Yiddish is the H variety of languages that was used in the Jewish holy books. So and biblical Hebrew was what the Bible was written in, and Spanish and Guarani in Paraguay, and even standard English and Caribbean Creole. So I will have more to say about code choices in such situations in the following sections. Now, number one would be that in what ways was the relationship between classical Latin and the vernacular Romance languages, particularly the languages presently known as French, Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese, a diglossic one for a number of centuries? The other would, and at what point did diglossia cease? And can we answer this last question with any great degree of precision? So the history of English in 3 centuries after 1066 is of considerable interest. So the Norman conquest established Norman French as the H variety and English as the L variety. So what caused English eventually to triumph and French to be eliminated from use in England? So except as a clearly marked foreign language. So where did Latin fit into the overall picture? Now there was and still is among certain ultra-Orthodox sects in Israel resistance to the use of the biblical Hebrew as a vernacular language. So that is as a language for everyday living. Now because they regard such use as profane. Now how different are biblical and modern Hebrew? If someone were to tell you that diglossia is but a simple reflection of the social, cultural, or political oppression of a people, how might you answer that? So how diglossic are classroom situations in which children who come to school speaking only a regional or social variety of English, well removed from the standard variety, are taught the standard variety and its various uses, particularly in use in writing? Then we would move on to bilingualism and multilingualism. Now, when we are considering bilingualism and multilingualism, we would say that monolingualism, that is the ability to use only one language, is such a widely accepted norm in so many parts of the Western world that it is often assumed to be a worldwide phenomena, to the extent that bilingual and multilingual individuals may appear to be unusual. So because we are so used to in our society of people just speaking one language of whatever country they're living in, so people who are bilingual or multilingual, who have a lot of knowledge of different languages, would be considered unusual. Now I find that in my situation also, that people find it very surprising when they hear that I know 7 different languages. Now, so I would be considered as a multilingual because I'm using Urdu, Punjabi, I'm using English, I'm using Russian, Korean, Uzbek, and Armenian. So if I have a knowledge of all of those languages, I would be considered unusual because a common person would maybe just know one language, the native language Urdu, or just English, or a bilingual would know English and Urdu as a combination, or maybe Punjabi also. So, but there are very few people who are multilingual in our society. So indeed, we often have mixed feelings when we discover that someone we meet is fluent in several languages. So I get that reaction from people also. They are very surprised sometimes, and sometimes they are appreciative of it, and they find it difficult to believe also that a person can learn so many languages at one time, but it is very easy if you have the dedication to learn a language. So perhaps a mixture of admiration and envy, but also occasionally a feeling of superiority in that many such people are not native to the culture in which we function. So such people are likely to be immigrants, visitors, or children of mixed marriages, and in that respect marked in some way, and such marking is not always regarded favorably. So sometimes they do regard it favorably and would say that yes, a multilingual person is unusual, and they would be admire that person or envy that person, but sometimes they would take it negatively in the society, and say that maybe because it's a mixed marriage, or the children that are born through mixed marriages, like my own situation, or that immigrants also, or visitors in this situation that coming from a different society or culture. So they might not mark it very or regard it very favorably. Now, however, in many parts of the world, an ability to speak more than one language is not at all remarkable. So maybe, yes, in one society it's remarkable because we have very few multilingual people here, but many parts of the world there are so many people who speak a variety of language. So for them maybe it's not that remarkable, it's just a common thing. So in fact, a monolingual individual would be regarded as a misfit in that society, lacking an important skill in society, the skill of being able to interact freely with the speakers of another language with whom a regular contact is made in the ordinary business living. So in many parts of the world, it is just a normal requirement of daily living that people should speak several languages, and they should know several different languages, but perhaps one or more at home at least. So another in the village, still another for purposes of trade, and yet another for contact with the outside world of wider social or political organizations. So these various languages are usually acquired naturally and unselfconsciously, and the shifts from one to another are made without hesitation. So people who are bilingual or multilingual do not necessarily have exactly the same abilities in the languages, or varieties, in fact, that the kind of parity may be exceptional. So as Sridhar in 1996 says, multilingualism involving balanced native-like command of all languages is the repertoire is rather uncommon. So any person having languages in the repertoire of being multilingualism involving a balanced information of the native language and command of a balanced command of all the different languages that he knows is a little uncommon. So a person could be multilingual, but he could be maybe good in let's say native language more than in the other languages. He wouldn't be that fluent in the other languages. So typically multilinguals have varying degrees of command of different repertoires. So the differences in competence in the various languages might range from command of a few lexical items or formulaic expressions such as greetings and rudimentary conversational skills, all the way to excellent command of the grammar and vocabulary and specialized register and styles. So Siddhar adds that multilinguals develop competence in each of the codes to the extent that they need it, and for the context in which each of the languages is used. So context determines language choice also. So in a society in which more than one language or variety is used, you must find out who uses what or when and for what purpose. So if you are to be socially competent, then your language choices are part of the social identity you claim for yourself. So in the previous paragraph I referred to varieties as well as languages in discussing the issues that concern us. So we would say that multilinguals would develop competence in each of the codes of every different language and the context in which they use the language, the different languages. And so context would determine the language choice. Now in a society which has more than one language, like for example our Pakistani society, we have so many languages because of different, or Indian society. And so we have a variety of use of language. We have Urdu, we have Punjabi, we have Sindhi, we have Balochi. So maybe in such a society, one language is used, when it's used, you must find it who uses what and what language is used where. So what we would say that in Punjab, Punjabi is used, in Balochistan, Balochi is used, and Sindh, they would speak more Sindhi and Urdu. So what they would do is that that person would know a variety of Urdu and Sindhi, but he wouldn't know Punjabi. So same vice versa, that a Punjabi will maybe know Urdu and Punjabi as a variety of language, but he wouldn't know Sindhi or Balochi. So sometimes you need to judge when and what and for what purpose do they know that. So if you're to be socially competent. Now your language choice once again shows your social identity, and that's the claim that you make for yourself. So how you prove to the world who you are and how you work is according to defined by your language. So in the previous paragraph I referred to varieties as well as languages in discussing the issues that concern us. Now this is a consequence of the difficulties of trying to distinguish languages from dialects and among dialects themselves. So consequently, attempts to distinguish people who are bilingual from those who are bidialectal may fail. So there may be some doubt that very many people are actually bi or even multi-dialectal. So sometimes that it would be difficult for us to try to distinguish the languages from the dialects. How we can say that yes, it's a dialect. So in our country, all of these forms are different dialects. They wouldn't be different languages used in our country. So maybe it's difficult for people to distinguish that if it is a multi-dialectal country or what. So they may speak varieties which are distinctly different. For example, I can say that in Punjabi they have 4 or 5 different varieties of speaking Punjabi. Like in Islamabad and Pindi, the people would speak it in a different way. In Lahore, they would speak it in a different way. And in, say, a village, they would have a different form of speaking. And maybe in the interior Punjab, they would have a totally different way of pronouncing and speaking the word. But the language would be the same, you see. All of it, maybe the pronunciations and a few words would differ, but all of it would be considered as Punjabi. So they can maybe speak varieties which are distinctly different, but whether each separate variety is generally a dialect depends on how one defines dialect. So which is not at all an easy matter to decide. So it's difficult for us. So, but we can say that those different forms in Punjabi would be dialects of Punjabi, not different languages of Punjabi. So it sometimes is too with deciding who is or who is not bilingual. Now, is someone who speaks both Hindi and Urdu bilingual? Who speaks both Serbian and Croatian, Nanorsk and Bokmal, or Russian and Ukrainian? So Russian is very different from Ukrainian, but do you think that that person would be bilingual? So I think yes, because Ukraine would have its own term of speaking, but it's very similar to Russian, see? And Serbian and Croatian are very similar, and Hindi and Urdu have very similar terms also. But they are two different languages. So we could consider some person as a bilingual if they know those languages. Now, such speakers may well tell you they are. But on the other hand, a Chinese who speaks both Mandarin and Cantonese will almost certainly insist that he or she speaks only two dialects of Chinese. So just as an Arab who knows both the colloquial variety and the classical literary variety of Arabic will insist that they are only different varieties of the same language. So for some people, yes, they would say that it's a part of different language, but some would say that it is just a different variety of the same language. So in some cases, then the bilingual or bidialectal distinction that speakers make reflect social, cultural, and political aspirations or realities rather than any linguistic reality. Now, what we will concern ourselves with then are unequivocal cases in which there can be no doubt that the two languages or codes are mutually unintelligible. So an interesting example of multilingualism exists among the Tucano of the northwest Amazon on the border between Colombia and Brazil. So you can see Sorensen in 1971 for that reference. So the Tucano are a multilingual people because men must marry outside their language group. So that is, no man may have a wife who speaks his language. For that kind of marriage relationship is not permitted and would be viewed as a kind of incest. So they choose a wife from a different language group and then bring that person into their family and teach them their language. So men choose the woman they marry from various neighboring tribes who speak other languages. Now, furthermore, on marriage, women move into the men's household or long houses. So consequently, in the village, several languages are used. So the language of the men, the various languages spoken by women who originate from different neighboring tribes, and a widespread regional trade language that they would use for trading with each other. So children are born into the multilingual environment also. The child's father speaks one language, the child's mother would speak another, and other women with whom the child has daily contact perhaps would speak something else. So however, everyone in the community is interested in language learning, so most people can speak most of the languages. So multilingualism is taken for granted. And moving from one language to another in the course of a single conversation is very common. So it's a very common practice of code switching. From moving from one language to another, it's very easy for them because they are used to doing that. So in fact, multilingualism is so usual that the Tucano are hardly conscious that they do speak different languages as they shift easily from one language to another language. So they cannot readily tell an outsider how many languages they speak and must be suitably prompted to enumerate which languages they speak and to describe how well they speak each one. Now, multilingualism is a norm in that community. It results from the pattern of marriage and the living arrangements consequent to a marriage. So communities are multilingual and no effort is made to suppress the variety of languages that are spoken. So it is actually seen as a source of strength, for it enables the speakers of the various linguistic communities to maintain contact with one another and provides a source for suitable marriage partners for those who seek them. So a man cannot marry one of his sisters, for example, a woman whose mother tongue is the same as his. So people are not strangers to one another by the reason of the fact that they cannot communicate when away from home. So when men from one village visit another village, they are likely to find speakers of their native language. So there will almost certainly be some women from the home village who have married into the village being visited, possibly even a sister. So the children of these women too will be fluent in their mother's tongue. So many others also will have learned some of it, because it is considered proper to learn to use the languages of those who you live with. So somewhat similar attitudes towards multilingualism have been reported from other parts of the world. Now, for example, Salisbury in 1962 reports that among the Siain of New Guinea, it is quite normal for people to know a number of languages. So they choose the most appropriate one for the particular circumstances in which they find themselves. So moreover, they prize language learning so that when someone who speaks a language they do not know enters a community. So people in the community will try to learn as much as they can about the language and to find occasions to use their learning. So students, I think that would be enough today. So you have learned a lot about multilingualism and bilingualism, and how the different codes are used in language, and how you can use and how multilingualists or bilingual would use code switching for the terms in learning language, and that's according to the societies or different societies that they live in. So we will continue social linguistics in the next lecture. So have a good day. Thank you.